Okay. Um, Let me see. I don't really think I have to do the personal introduction thing. Maybe I'll just skip that and we'll just talk about the subject here. And in them, just to say that I've got a noisy dog here. So if the mailman comes up and the dog goes off, I'll have to get up here and put the dog in the bedroom or something like that. And so this subject of service planning, obviously, this is a big subject, and it's got a lot of dimensions to it. And so I guess what I want to say, and I am going to go back and talk some about the research on service planning, but I guess the first thing I want to say, as much as anything else, is that it probably matters as much how people do service planning with families as what's actually in the service plans. I mean, so it's not just a matter of needing to come up with a plan that sort of meets the needs or the challenges that families face, and that something is going to have to be done about before kids can leave foster care and go back to families. I mean, as important as that is, for plans to succeed, people have to think about not just what's in the plans, but how you arrive at the plans. And so that, of course, means concretely that parents need to be involved in the case planning process, even when there's a dependency action, even when it's all a matter of mandates and everything. Parents need to be involved in the planning to the extent that they can be. And that's going to vary depending on the parent involved. And sometimes it's going to vary depending on their attorney. Some attorneys view that in a suspicious manner, while others don't. So ideally, when kids are legally dependent, if you just talk about how it ought to be set up, there really ought to be a team of people, and it ought to involve, of course, obviously the caseworker, the parents, the CASA, some of the key service providers, and the foster parent. If the foster parent and the birth parents are on speaking terms and the foster parent feels comfortable with that, then so ideally that would be the way that case planning would be done. It would be done through an interactive process in which, parents' views are heard, and at least their input is given some due thought and consideration before someone just writes out a plan and gives it to a court, and a court signs it and says you have to do this, right? So that's easier to do in the context when you have, for example, there are safe baby courts in this state, quite a few of them at this point, seemingly, some of them funded by the feds. There have always been some family treatment drug courts, which are kind of similar kind of format, but not exactly the same in that they don't necessarily focus on babies. But many of the same ideas are used in the family treatment drug courts. But even when that is not true, there still needs to be a way for people to come together and talk about what needs to be in these plans. And it just isn't quite as obvious as maybe a lot of times it seems at first glance. I mean, of course, the parents here, we're talking about planning for, I think Ryan described it as complex cases. And what that concretely means is that we're talking about really troubled families here. And particularly if their kids are in foster care, it's probably more than 50% of the time there's going to be drug alcohol issues. And in a great majority of those cases, there's going to be a co-occurring mental health disorder. A lot of times, of course, there's domestic violence. Poverty is almost always present, and a lot of times not dealt with very well in terms of these plans. And with many of the kids, and the kids themselves have all kinds of needs. And then there is, of course, the issue of the visitation arrangements, which we're going to talk about that here in just a minute, maybe at some length here. So in other words, there's a wide array of needs. And so what happens a lot of times in the planning process is that without even talking about it much or thinking about it, planners, and this tends to mean initially the caseworker or the public agency, they tend to think about putting everything into these plans, and particularly into these first orders that they think is needed before kids can return home. And of course, that can, in theory, be a long list of things. As I've just mentioned, I mean, there could be easily half a dozen elements on these initial plans, and sometimes it's even more than that. So, of course, one of the things that lots of both quantitative research and qualitative research over the years, and by qualitative research, I mean the kind of studies where an academic researcher goes and actually talks with parents about it and summarizes their views in an article. So the idea here, I guess, initially I want to come back to is that it's possible to make these plans so long and so demanding that there's really very little chance that parents are going to succeed at doing it. And in fact, it's almost a self-defeating kind of thing. Like if you really want to defeat somebody and who has faced some really difficult challenge, just overwhelm them with the amount of demands and things that they're expected to do here, and don't give them a lot of help in doing it. If you want people to help to fail at reunification, that's kind of the way to do it. You give people a bunch of referrals and tell them to go to this, that, and the other agency, and regardless of their circumstances, their resources, their work schedules, if they are working. So, of course, that's not what we want to do in terms of case planning. We want to think about, even if we have in mind a long list of things, or a fairly long list of things that we think need to happen in families before kids can go back to live there safely, we still want to think at any one time, in any one 6-month period, we want to be thinking about a doable list of things that people could actually do in the next several months or so that would have a benefit for themselves and their kids. And that tends to be a short list. And so for years, the group of people that at Harborview did these evaluations, the people, Lucy Berliner, her colleagues at Harborview who did these evaluations of a lot of these families, over the years, they just came back to this theme over and over again. And the theme is more is not better. When you talk about service planning, more is not better. You want to think about shorter list of things. And even if you're dealing with a commissioner or a judge who insists that every single thing that a family needs to do before a child can be returned has got to be incorporated into the first order, even if you have a judge and commissioner who makes that kind of requirement and cannot be talked out of it, you still have to think about, well, how would we sequence all of that? Because it isn't all going to happen, particularly if the list is lengthy. It's not going to happen in the first several months, or a lot of times, sometimes even in the first year, if you're dealing with people in a way that gives them half a chance of succeeding at this. The lists have got to be somewhat shorter. And so what that means concretely is that there has to be some thinking about how to sequence when you have these families, complex families, so to speak, with lots of challenges. There has to be thinking about, well, how would you sequence all the services that are actually needed there? So if there's substance abuse, if there's mental health issues, if there's DV, there's issues related to poverty, issues related to children's development, and sometimes all kind of other things. I mean, the families really have a whole wide range of needs here. And so one of the first discussions, and this is best done in a team format, is, well, where do we kind of start here? And so when I worked in child welfare, and I worked in this state from 1978 to 2004. Before that, I worked in Colorado for 7 years. For a very long time, probably 20 to 30 years or so, the practice wisdom idea was that if parents had drug alcohol issues, no matter what their other issues were, the idea always was to start off with the drug alcohol kind of first, on the grounds that before people could do other things, well, they needed to get clean and sober, or at least ideally get started in a recovery kind of process. Okay, it just happens that over the years, research has not necessarily been kind to that practice guideline. So much to my surprise, over the years, I've read studies where it sort of is the other way around. I mean, sometimes people do things to improve their parenting, and it makes it easier for them to become clean and sober. Sometimes people improve their parenting, their ability to manage their children in a way that's positive, and so they're less depressed as a result, right? So I guess what I'm saying, there is no research-based guideline at this point that says that when you have families that have these multiple needs, that you ought to begin with A, and then you ought to do B, and then you ought to do C. There is no research like that. Those ideas were all based on practice wisdom, which turns out to be, as usual, kind of fallible. So what that means then, of course, is there really are some legitimate kind of choices there when you're talking about how to sequence services and where to kind of start with things. Then there really are some usually reasonable kind of choices and options, and parents ought to be able to have some say in that. And at least the people who are doing the planning ought to listen to what parents have got to say about it. And sometimes it'll be commonsensical kind of stuff. It will be initially that parents start off with drug and alcohol issues, maybe a lot of the time, but maybe that's not always true. So let me stop. Before I go on and say anything more, let me kind of stop here and see if you have comments or questions about the question of where do you start with service planning. Okay, so just a couple of other thoughts there. Regardless of where you start, one of the main lessons from research over the last 20 or 30 years is that if people are going to be successful in completing services as mandated by courts, then they're going to have some emotional support to do that. And by emotional support, that means people who are paying attention to them, giving them timely feedback on their progress, and timely meaning weekly, if not daily. And where if there's bad behavior, and a lot of times there is going to be bad behavior because, of course, we're dealing with drug alcohol issues and with depression. Both substance abuse and mental health, of course, are chronically relapsing conditions, and that turns out to be true of domestic violence as well a lot of the time. So when you talk about a therapeutic kind of likely path of recovery, it's going to be a up and down, 2 steps forward, 1 step back kind of a thing. It isn't going to be like a gradual, steady walk up the mountain where people are making little progress initially and then greater progress. No, people are going to fall and they're going to slide back down the mountain. They are going to relapse from time to time. And so when that happens, there needs to be ability to immediately recognize it and respond to it. So this is kind of what emotional support means. It doesn't mean that we're always praising people, particularly when they're engaged in questionable or actually really bad behavior. But it does mean that there's a recognition of what they're doing. There's a recognition of the challenge of it. And they're given a lot of encouragement along the way. So if we're doing challenging things, everyone, not just the parents we deal with, everyone needs encouragement, a pat on the back, some praise from time to time, a recognition of the difficulties. Everyone needs that. And that is true in child welfare as in any other area. So some of the lessons about service planning are just really common-sensy lessons. I mean, if we want people to succeed at things, then we have to put them in a situation where they have emotional support for doing these tough things. And I've already said, ideally, that would be through teams, but there are other ways as well. So in this state and in lots of other states as well, there are peer kind of programs where parents who've succeeded in recovery and have gotten their kids back from foster care mentor the birth parents and give concrete guidance and encouragement, and sometimes they act as safety monitors as well. And so that's a model for giving encouragement. And so if we want people to succeed in child welfare, there has to be that kind of support available. And again, that is partly emotional support, and it doesn't always have to come from just a single person. That's why that's the function a lot of times of a team. One of the reasons those safe baby courts and those family treatment drug courts are good is because they meet pretty frequently, either weekly or biweekly, and parents get a lot of immediate feedback, a lot of it praise, but sometimes it isn't praise. Sometimes it's just calling people on their behavior and then having a discussion about, well, now that you've fallen down the mountain, you've gone 2 steps back. What are you going to do now? I mean, what's the next step? And so again, to repeat this one more time at the risk of being a little tiresome here. So we have to think about giving people as much choice and influence and say in their plans, even when they're court ordered, as possible within reasonable kind of limits. And people need to have quite a bit of encouragement as along the way and help. And sometimes that means not just encouragement, it means concrete, the overcoming of obstacles. It means, particularly I would say with the parents that we deal with, it means helping them with official agencies. You know, when I think about the way these, the economic service programs, TANF, the food stamp programs, all the programs that are set up there in this state and other states to help families, the way they're set up, there are these bureaucracies. There are a lot of times they're very difficult to access, and rules are set up in ways that aren't necessarily helpful. And a lot of times they're almost seemingly set up to keep people from getting services. You know, some of the most recent research, and that includes in this state, has found that probably not more than a quarter of families, of low-income families that are eligible for TANF are actually receiving TANF. Well, why is that? Because economic services has set up an obstacle course, and it's really difficult to negotiate that. And particularly if people have poor social skills and they're not very articulate and they lose their temper when they deal with the, you know, people in agencies, and they're very quick to give up. You know, so all the ways that the agencies are set up are kind of ways that would really very frustrating to most of us, but completely defeating to a lot of the parents that we deal with here who don't have a lot of confidence in their own abilities to deal with anything, much less with agencies who just aren't very interested in helping them in the first place and are very, very quick to rule them out when they screw up in whatever kind of way. So just one kind of brief story here. My wife and I have a friend who was for years a homeless guy, and he now lives in some supported housing in the Tacoma area. And every year he has to re-up his application and everything. So recently we helped him do that. This application, this is a guy who has brain damage, traumatic brain damage. He has mental illness. On his best day, he would have trouble with this. 30-page application, 30 pages, where the questions are repeated in all kind of different kind of ways. And then my wife helps him fill it out, fills out the whole thing for him, and has to do it and can't do it on computer, has to do it with, you know, on a written form. Gets to the end of the thing, does the thing. He takes the thing. My wife actually does it. He didn't do it. She fills out everything just according to the rules. He takes the 30-page form back to the agency that has to approve his housing support voucher, and they tell him that it's in the wrong kind of ink. It has to be in blue ink rather than black ink, or it's black ink rather than blue ink. I mean, it's something as ridiculous as that. And then they don't give him any reason why that has to be like that. And of course, at that point, he blows his gasket, as most of us would. And of course, my wife hears that and she just infuriated. Well, she knows how to control her anger in a way that's productive. The guy we're helping, he not always able to do that. So people who have had very difficult experiences in life may not even have a high school degree or not much education. Just dealing with these official agencies, a lot of times they really do need help in order to get help. And that's something that I think sometimes CASAs can do that. I think that sometimes parent mentors can do that. Sometimes there used to be a time when caseworkers actually did good things like that. Not maybe so much anymore, which is sad. So that's the kind of the emotional support, the concrete support idea for it. And so one piece of research that you may be aware of, but if not, you ought to be, is that probably when you talk about plans that are mandated by courts, it would be very, very surprising if any state, if as many as 1 in 2, 3 in 5 parents completed those plans, that would be really, really good. There was a time in the 1990s when not more than a quarter of parents who were mandated to receive substance abuse services were actually entering and completing the service program, not more than 25%. And then over the years, agencies and private agencies and helping agencies figured out how to help people in a way that would increase those rates of completion, of treatment completion. And it's the kind of stuff that I just mentioned here. It's the empowerment practices, it's the teaming, it's putting people in a context where it's understood that from time to time they're going to have reverses, they're going to screw up, there's going to be relapse, and they have to sort of get up and they have to get moving up the mountain again. So and they're going to need some help in doing that. So let me stop with that. And see if I have a comment or question. Okay, so I want to say a little something real briefly about the issue of relapse in service planning, because of course, again, to say this one more time, it's not just drug and alcohol that are chronically relapsing conditions. The mental health ailments, mostly the mood disorders, depression, anxiety, PTSD, these are as chronically relapsing conditions as drug alcohol is. And most of the people that we deal with, the really troubled families, most of them have some combination, obviously, of drug, alcohol, and mental health conditions, usually depression, but a lot of times it's multiple stuff there. And so there is periodically, there is going to be relapse. So I guess the idea I want to get across is here, we should expect relapse, but we shouldn't take it lightly. That is, even though we know it's going to happen from time to time, it doesn't mean that when it does happen, it's insignificant, or we should just shrug it off or say, well, what else did you expect to happen, or something like that. No. Sometimes kids' safety really can be threatened through a relapse. And particularly, let's just say that, a kid has been in foster care and now has gone home on some kind of what's called a trial home visit, where they're actually at home, but they're still being counted as being in foster care. There's still a legal order, and there is a relapse there, right? So the first thing public agencies need to know is that when they are aware that a parent is relapsing, they need to go find that kid immediately. That would be true of all of you as well. If there's recognition that there's relapse, there should be an immediate response to that. You have to go check on and then, of course, there needs to be an effort to get the family back with a treater person, or whether that's a substance abuse treatment person or a mental health therapist or whoever it is. And so always the question in relapse, always the question is whether someone is going to take it as a reversal and they're going to redouble their commitment to a recovery process, or whether the relapse is just going to take them out of recovery entirely. And it can be either way. It can be either way. So for those of you, anyone who's ever, for example, been on a diet, I don't think there's any person in the world who's ever been on a diet for weeks or months who has not occasionally had a relapse and gone back and eaten stuff that they're not supposed to be eating and so forth, right? So that's 100% of the time. And so the question, of course, then for the dieter person is, well, what's going to happen next? I mean, if I blew it at Thanksgiving dinner and I had 3 types of pie and sweet potatoes and every other thing you can think of under the sun, the question is, what do I do the day after Thanksgiving? That's the really important question. What do I do the day after that? Do I get back on the diet and again begin to, eat sensibly in a way that I'm committed to? Or do I just say, well, hey, I've just blown it, and so I might as well finish off the pecan pie. Why should I leave half the pecan pie there? People can think of all kinds of excuses for some really, really bad behavior. Well, that is also true, of course, when you're talking about relapse in drug alcohol or and it's true. And when it comes to even domestic violence, which in some instances also looks like for some couples, looks like a chronically relapsing kind of a condition there. So that's an important question. And that's why it's very helpful to be meeting in teams. Of course, when kids go back to families and these trial home visits, and then in the 6 months afterwards, and as long as the kid is going to be legally dependent, of course, most of the time, those teams are not going to be meeting weekly, but it would be very helpful if they met either bi-weekly or monthly, at the very least. But if they're not doing, because it's going to be a struggle. I don't know, say the common sensey thing here, you're talking about people who are dealing with very, very difficult challenges here. And so it's going to be a struggle, and it's not going to be easy. And so we already kind of know that the reentry into care rate is 15% in the first year. That's sort of an average across the country. It's about 25 to 30% over a period of 3 to 5 years. And it's even higher for when babies go back to substance abusing moms. It's even higher than that. So there's going to be a period when people need to stay involved with families there. So again, let me stop here before I change the subject here and give you a chance for a comment or a question.
Hi, this is Wiping Lee Landis with the King County Dependency CASA program. I'm sorry, can you hear me? I mean,
yes, I can hear you.
Given the federal mandate or guidelines about 15 months, after removal or no progress, and it should, have a termination petition filed. Would you mind to comment on that legal deadline versus, the reality of parents needing that kind of support and struggling? How do we proceed? Yeah, thank you.
Well, given that, and of course, as you, I'm sure know, this has become now a big controversial issue in child welfare, these AFSA timelines and so forth. But the 15 out of 22 months, that's a federal guideline. I think actually in Washington, it's 12 out of 19 months or something. I mean, in a lot of states, they've limited those timelines in an even more rigid kind of way. And so kind of what that concretely means for parents who have drug alcohol issues, and again, a lot of the parents do, is that they really, within a very few months, I mean, maybe there's a 2 or 3 months where they don't get into treatment, but if they have a real chance of meeting that guideline, they got to be in treatment within about a 90-day period of time in order to have a reasonable chance of getting their kids back in this 12 to 18 kind of month window. And what parents just cannot do is they just cannot sit around and do little or nothing for a year. And then now they're facing a termination action, and now they're going to enter treatment. I mean, that federal law was passed to stop that kind of scenario from happening. Now, the actual research on the extent to which state agencies conform to those AFSA guidelines is, and in this state, there's been a lot of research of that type over the years. It isn't more than half the time that child welfare offices are really following those guidelines in a strict way. And sometimes it's because parents are making progress and there's a reasonable expectation that they need a few months longer. And sometimes it's because kids are with relatives, so the caseworkers don't necessarily feel that there's this kind of urgency there. And sometimes it's because they don't, with school-age kids, they don't really necessarily feel that they have a good option. I think where you really have the really difficult kind of decisions to make is when a parent has been in treatment for some time and they really are struggling and they have had multiple relapses, and clearly they're trying, but at the same time, they're not doing really, they're very, very bumpy road in treatment. And now you're coming up against the deadline. And I don't have any kind of strict rule of thumb about how to proceed in those types of cases. I mean, I think, that's sort of case by case. You have to kind of call it. And of course, it depends to a certain extent on the judge and commissioner you're dealing with in some way. Now, I do think, and it's my personal opinion, that those AFSA guidelines make a lot more sense and are more defensible morally and ethically when you're talking about babies, very, very young kids. I think when you get to the school-age kids, it becomes much, much more questionable about the strict application of those timelines. Because of course, those school-age kids already have usually some pretty strong relationships with those parents, a lot of times, which are very, very difficult to break. And so I mean, but AFSA doesn't at this point make those kind of distinctions based on ages, but I think it ought to. So I guess the short version of this, at least from my standpoint, is that I would be more tempted to apply AFSA guidelines pretty rigidly if children entered care as infants, or if they entered care before the age of 2. And if they're in a pretty stable home, I mean, if there really is a permanent planning option there. And parents either got into treatment very late in a very delayed kind of way, or they got into treatment and they just had a lot of difficulty because of the relapse thing, right? So I would be me personally, more inclined to apply the AFSA guideline pretty rigidly in those cases with the very little kids, and less rigidly in the cases as kids get somewhat older here. But of course, every case is somewhat different, and has idiosyncratic features, and so just a couple of instances there where I do want to point out kind of what I think ought to be obvious is that you shouldn't go around terminating parental rights unless you have an option for a kid. Now this might just sound obvious, but in past years, it was really an issue in this state. I don't know whether it still is. But because of those AFSA timelines do not make distinctions based on ages of kids. But what if you have an 8 or 9, 10-year-old kid who's behaviorally troubled and who's been bounced around in foster care already? And now the parents aren't getting with the program, and now you're up against the deadline. Do you just terminate parental rights on an 8 or 9-year-old kid without having an adoptive family waiting, or the kid's already with that family, betting on the come, so to speak? No, in my view, never. Never with the school-age kid. It's different with the little ones because, of course, you do know that you are going to be able to find an adoptive family there. But even with some of those kids, for various reasons, some of them have had these checkered kind of placement histories where they have not been in a stable pre-adopt home at all for various reasons. And so it isn't as obvious to me in those situations exactly what the right thing to do is in the sense of being able to formulate a guideline that would apply across the board to cases with all kind of different kind of features there. So I do think that probably my anticipation in the next couple of years, I think there's a growing consensus in child welfare that the AFSA guidelines need to at least be revised in some way, and I think they probably will be at some point in time. But just to say this again, even with those guidelines in place, even in this state, which I think a lot of times it's made a pretty good faith effort to apply those guidelines a lot of the time, it hasn't happened more than half the time. for all kind of reasons, some of which I've mentioned. I don't know whether that answers your question or not, but maybe it's the best I can do there. I do want to say something about visits here quickly here. So, and all of you CASAs, you know that the general perspective on infants and toddlers is that the more they're visiting parents, the better, and because of all the issues around attachment and connection and so forth. And of course, that turns out to be very hard to do for caseworkers who have too many cases. And so when courts are ordering 2, 3, 4 visits a week a lot of the time, and somehow the agency is supposed to do that, a lot of times that's just, when I worked in child welfare, that was a tear your hair kind of thing, because we didn't have the resources, we didn't have, and of course the agency ended up doing all kinds of things like paying drivers to drive kids around. But so ideally, I guess the point I'm trying to make here is that it's much easier, better from every standpoint, from the standpoint of parent-child visitation, if the foster parents can be involved in that in some way. And a lot of times it's really possible. I don't think it's something that foster parents should be mandated to do, forced to do. I don't think they should be arm twisted into it. But I think the extent to which foster parents can enter into cooperative, friendly relationships with birth parents, I think that's a good thing. I've dealt with many foster parents in the past who actually would, after they got to know a foster parent, would let them visit in the foster home. And that makes these daily or almost daily visits a heck of a lot easier, almost possible. But when you're talking about having to set up visits in an office or a visitation center with all kind of problems in transportation and so forth, and doing 3 or 4 visits a week on every child on a caseload, wow, you just wipe out an agency by doing that. And a lot of courts have been merciless there, both in this state and other states as well. Like, we don't care what your resources are. We think this is what the science says, this is what we want you to do, blah, blah, blah. So I think there has to be, as an ex-child welfare person who had to deal with this all the time, I think there just has to be an effort, more of an effort whenever possible, to bring the foster parents or the relatives, if they have the kids, into the equation around how to do visits, kind of thing. I think foster parents can be exceedingly helpful to birth parents in coaching and giving encouragement and so forth. So I think that's the kind of model that we ought to aspire to. And again, without coercing anybody, without making foster parents do that kind of thing. And of course, it's not going to work with every birth parent, because some small percentage of the birth parents really are in fact dangerous and or mentally ill or something like that. But a lot of them, it would work fine. I think having visits in offices, I think that's really bad. And I think that should only happen when there's absolutely no other option. So bringing a mother in for an hour to visit a kid in some room with a few toys and nothing on the walls, that's poor. Some offices in this state have set up a visitation area that's really nice. I mean, the Vancouver office did that in past years. That was really, they really had a nice area. They spent a lot of money, thought, effort into making the visits comfortable and fun, enjoyable. I think what happens in those visits is of great importance. And in terms of assessing when it's safe for kids to go home, and I think that's something as CASAs you ought to be aware of, that periodically you ought to observe those visits. Because of course, if kids are going to go home and be safe, then parents have to have the ability not just to interact with kids without harming them, they actually need to sometimes at least enjoy being in their company. And that means the ability to interact with kids, appropriately. And so I think, actually putting eyes on the visits from time to time is good. I think it's, on the other hand, I would have to say that having visits in an office and then having some monitor in the visit who's sitting there taking notes that's, I can't imagine anything more off-putting than that in terms of helping a parent who's struggling to develop a relationship with a young child who's in foster care. I just can't imagine something that's more off-putting than doing visits in that kind of fashion. So I think there really does need to be some thinking about how to do the visits in a way that's comfortable, that enhances the potential enjoyment of visits. Sometimes they can be in parks, sometimes it can be in McDonald's, or it can be in other places. And it doesn't always have to be supervised. That's true in the initial stages, but after that, not. And I can't imagine what anyone is thinking who thinks that we're going to monitor all these visits really closely up to the point where some kid goes home and then we're not going to do anything. We're going to go from monitoring every second that a parent's in the presence of a child to a situation where we don't see a parent and a child for a few weeks, and somehow that makes rational sense, but it doesn't make rational sense. So there needs to be sort of a gradual sort of extension of the time in which parents can visit kids in an unsupervised kind of way. And if we don't trust that, the kid shouldn't be going home, just to say the obvious thing there, right? And of course, parents also need to be able to deal with kids when it's not just fun, when it is changing diapers, when it is putting up with the orneriness or the irascibility of kids. I mean, because that's parenting. So parents have to be able to, so to speak, accommodate that and be able to emotionally cope with that. And that's something that, of course, you find out through visits. So the visits are important. I do not subscribe to the idea that more is always better, but at least a couple of visits a week when you're talking about very little kids, that would be something certainly you would want to do. And with sometimes maybe even more if you can get the cooperation of the foster parents and or the relative, if a relative has, if a child is in the care of a relative. So let me stop and again and give you a chance to for a comment or a question here. Okay, just a few minutes we have. I kind of want to spend this last part of this presentation or session talking about, well, how do we evaluate the progress of parents in these service plans? I mean, so how do we know that services are actually working? So one of the things you don't want to give into is the idea that we're going to make reunification decisions and courts are going to make those kind of decisions with input from CASAs and caseworkers based solely on whether parents are complying with court orders. That's a way to get kids killed. That is a bad idea. And that is something, because it's simple, it's kind of like simple rules of the game, you know, it's kind of objective. It's pretty easy to figure out whether someone actually completed drug alcohol treatment or some other kind of treatment, you know. So sometimes the public defenders, they really like this system of rules where all we're looking at is whether parents complied with a court order. But parents can comply with a court order completely and maybe the kids aren't safer at all. So we actually need better guidelines and indicators of whether people are actually making changes, right? And so given that, years ago, I came up with these guidelines or these rules of thumb that I call MEERS, MEERS in caps, sort of an acronym, which is a set of indicators to help us determine whether it's going to be safe for kids to go back into the, you know, the family home after they spent time in foster care. And probably the most important single one of those rules for anyone who has drug alcohol issues, for any parent, if that's a main reason why kids are in foster care, is that the motivation of the parent has to have fundamentally changed. From where drugs are their first priority, sometimes their only priority, to a situation where kids are their first priority. Maybe not their only priority, but their first priority. That is a fundamental shift in motivation. And so the key issue in child safety for people who have the drug alcohol issues is whether the parent has made that shift. And that's something that you can't depend here on just compliance with court orders. You can't depend on what parents say about it because they can learn to say the right things. You have to sort of look at behavior over time. And so I think most of us are pretty darn good at figuring out social behavior if we have if we have a big sample of that behavior over a period of time, we can figure out what people are really about. And so I think it's very helpful to think of what are the indicators that the motivation of parents have actually changed in the way that they need to change. That is, kids come first, not drugs come first. Whether that transformation has really happened. And so you think about, well, how do most of us figure out whether the people we're intimate with, whether our spouses or friends, kids, coworkers, whether they really have a goal to do something? And we're pretty good at figuring it out based on their behavior. And so part of an indicator of motivation is that we persist at things even though they're very difficult. If we're really motivated to do something, we don't give up real quickly when there's an obstacle in the road. We stick with it. I mean, even when it's very frustrating and challenging. And with some of the parents we deal with, that's very hard for them because they've had a history of being defeated by life in various kind of ways, and they've had a lot of negative kind of experiences. But if they're going to succeed, if they're motivated to get their kids back, then okay. And over the years, by the way, the visitation record and lots of the early research and identification, the best indicator of whether parents were going to get their kids back was the visitation record, whether they were visiting the kid consistently, because again, that is an indicator of motivation. If I'm interested in getting my kid out of foster care, I'm going to show up for visits on a pretty consistent, regular kind of basis. So the visitation record is kind of arguably a proxy for the motivational kind of change that we need to see there. I think the key change you see a lot of the time is that parents can really think of the interest of kids as separate from their own. That's the key indicator. When there is a potential conflict between the interest of a parent and the interest of a child, the parent prioritizes the interest of their child, and they're able to do that. And there are times when lots of parents just cannot see the interest of their kids as in any way different than their own interest. It's almost like they don't even get the concept. But they really do need to see the difference there. And sometimes that shows up in the kind of relationships that parents maintain. I mean, this has always been one of the issues with domestic violence over the years, whether a substance abusing parent is going to maintain a relationship with a violent partner or not. I mean, this kind of issue has, been a source of contention with DV advocates over the years. But truthfully, I have to think that a lot of times it is an indicator. If someone is hurting my kid and hurting me, then parent has to decide what's kind of important here. So I think that's important. I've already mentioned the issue of enjoyment in visits. I think that's very, very important. And of course, at some point in the plans, you kind of want service plans at some time to deal with parenting skills. There's a question always when the right time is to introduce that element into service plans. And the idea used to be always after the provision of drug alcohol services, but I've already mentioned there's some research that says that sometimes it's better to start off with parenting skills and do it the other way around. But at some point before kids go home, clearly parents have got to acquire better ways of coping with the difficult, challenging behavior of kids. So they do need to learn skills. And kind of one of the ways that I think you find out pretty quickly whether that skills have been acquired that are going to be sustainable and lasting, is whether under conditions of great stress does the parent retain the skill. Because of course what happens with most of us, if we acquire new skills, but when challenged or when under great stress, then a lot of times we revert to old habits. We go back, we somehow can't remember how to do the new skill at a time when we're really challenged. So that's so at some point there's going to have to be so the skill thing has got to be, and of course the indicator of skills is not what people say, it's in their behavior. And that's why a lot of times, again, observing the visits, making home visits during these trial home visit kind of things, I think that's an important thing to be able to do. See whether the parents have really acquired new ways of responding to negative behavior or dealing with the emotional outburst of kids. And a lot of kids in foster care have emotion regulation problems. So that's one of the reasons they sometimes bounce around from home to home. But they have those same problems when they go back to the parents. And a lot of adults have a lot of trouble in dealing with that. When kids have the kind of tantrums, these explosive tantrums, where it's very difficult to calm them down. So that's one of the concrete skills that parents really need to learn, how to deal with that, with the outburst, with the meltdown kind of thing. And it turns out that there, just as I mentioned in presentations within the last 3 or 4 months, there's great resources out there now for that kind of stuff. So there's been a tremendous improvement in knowledge and in understanding of how to deal with emotion regulation issues over the last decade or two. So some of that knowledge has got to be acquired by parents. And then a lot of the parents really are going to need resources. And I cannot say this too strongly, because somehow it just is very difficult in a child welfare setting to get this idea across that people who are poor need help with concrete stuff. And that is going to be true post-reunification as well as before kids are reunified. And that means concrete stuff: food, clothing, shelter, blah, blah, blah. And it means childcare. So everyone who's a CASA should understand the idea that if kids go back and they're in the preschool age range, before a kid enters kindergarten, if they're actually being reunified with a birth parent, that kid ought to be in childcare many hours a week in a good childcare program every time. That ought to be a part of orders. That ought to be a mandated service that an agency has to provide, and a parent really does have to accept if their kids are in the 0 to 4-year-old age range when they go back. But there's other resources as well. Housing, you can't say too much about that. And then there have been some very, very disturbing studies, very disturbing to me, in the last 2 to 3 years, is that you're talking about anywhere from 1 in 7 kids in this country to 1 in 4, depending on the minority group, on the racial ethnic identity of kids, who are food insecure at any point in time. It means they don't have enough to eat. They don't have enough to eat. So that kind of concern has got to be there when kids go back into families. Kids who go back to birth parents have to have enough to eat. They have to have medical care. They have to have a decent place to live. Those are all important things that child welfare agencies should be thinking about, but somehow don't think about enough. So sometimes advocates for parents and for kids have to fill in the gap there. They have to get involved in that kind of question. So it turns out that there's a lot of differences in the resources available to families, both in this state and every other state, between cities and rural areas. Like if you live in Seattle, that's one thing. If you live in some other areas, like, I was regional administrator in Region 6, where we had all those, you live in Raymond. You live in Aberdeen, Hoquiam, places like that. I mean, the kind of services and the resources that are available to families just are not the same. as if you live in Olympia, Tacoma, Seattle, Everett, and whatever, right? And so that directly impacts the safety of kids. That is a social justice issue. And it's one that doesn't focus on race, ethnicity. It focuses on rural areas versus urban areas. So to me, it's much harder to be sure of what's going to happen with kids once they're reunified when they're in rural areas where there just aren't any services to help people. But in King County and Pierce County, there's a lot of stuff there if you know how to go find it. So that's also very, very important. So that's the mirror stuff, right? And then the last one is that parents have to have acquired the ability to do some stuff for themselves. So that's the self-efficacy thing, that is. So part of what happens with drug, alcohol, and mental health issues, DV, and so forth, is that gradually, little by little, people lose the ability to do things on their own behalf. They lose the ability to take initiative on their own behalf, or even to do ordinary, normal stuff that most of us just take for granted. People have got to relearn those skills who have lost them. That's the sort of the recapturing self-efficacy part of things. And again, the indicator of that is behavior. That is, people can reach out, they can ask for help. When they need help, they ask for help. They can actually make use of community services because they're willing to, accept and give it a try there. At the same time, they do reasonable things on their own behalf. So self-efficacy doesn't mean being totally independent. It doesn't mean being totally self-sustaining or some idea like that. It means being able to do stuff in an interdependent way on one's own behalf. And it means not being immobilized concretely. You're not immobilized, you're not paralyzed. The first time you reach a challenge, the first idea is we don't just throw in the towel. People problem solve, so anyway, so those are the MERS criteria. That's the MERS idea, the criteria, as a way of evaluating whether kids are going to be safe when they go back into families. And again, to say this one more time, those reunification decisions cannot just be a matter of determining whether parents complied with a court order. And that's the way to have child deaths. And my fear, and the reason I'm saying this so strongly right here, is because I fear, I don't know this for a fact, but based on what I've heard impressionistically, I fear that is actually going on in this state at this time to a greater extent than occurred in past years. I think that kids are being reunified to some extent based on faith, based on ideology, based on social justice ideas, based on all kinds of reasons that don't necessarily have much to do with child safety, but have a heck of a lot to do with social values. And I hope I'm wrong there, but I don't believe I am. So, okay, so let me stop there. It's 12 o'clock and see if you have comments or questions there. Someone on a.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So, and you've been around a lot longer than I have in this world. And what I'm noticing right now is the DCYF in our area is not willing to file anything at all. And there's plenty of things happening, but I don't know what's happening within the department, but it seems like there's a lot of motivation to avoid filing. Is this something that you see like cyclically within social workers, departments, local offices? What is your experience with that?
In past years, it was cyclical kind of stuff, but now it's becoming something that's much, much different than that. So child welfare in this country is in the middle of a sea change in values. And so there's a widespread view that child welfare has been way too punitive, that kids have been removed from homes way too frequently for inadequate reasons, and that a lot of those placements could have been prevented if services were in place, or And that's all intertwined with concerns around race and with racism. And so yeah, so what's gone on in a lot of places, and I think it's not just true in Washington, it's true all over the place, is that there's a very, a very negative view of foster care, which to some extent, of course, is warranted. And a lot of times a reluctance to place kids in care just based on ideological kind of reasons, really. So yeah, and that is also true, I think, on the reunification front. So yes, I do think that that is going on here. And in child welfare reform, and this is for a long time. I was at Casey Family Program from 2010 to 2016 at the time when, of course, their main goal was a 50-50 reduction in foster care by 2020. But at that point, child welfare reform was viewed, and the reduction of numbers of kids in foster care, they were viewed as almost the same thing. I mean, to reform a child welfare system was to reduce the number of kids in foster care. And I think that idea has taken very much strong root in this state. And I think that managers are being rewarded. They're being praised for not putting kids in foster care, just based solely on numbers, without necessarily looking at each case on its own kind of merits there. So I think what's going on is dangerous, to say the least. I think part of it has to do with sort of the shortage of foster homes and the fact that, you can put kids in foster care where they have very bad experiences. And in part, that's based on shortages. Partly it's based that you don't have the kind of foster parents you need to deal with the behaviorally troubled kids. So this is something I think that has been building up over 15, 20 years. It's not recent, but it's now all come to a head within the last year or so. So there's very dramatic changes going on in child welfare that have to do with a questioning about even its basic worth. Do we even need child welfare systems at all? It's actually gotten to that point around the country where people, serious people, in management and policymaking positions are asking themselves the question, well, maybe just be better if we didn't have a child welfare system. Well, if you're starting to think like that, and you can find any reason at all not to put kids in care, because the idea would be that, the pain of removal, the trauma of removal would be worse than leaving them in the home, then people can always think of a rationale for not putting kids in care. And so what I've tried to say in the last several years, and say it over and over and over again, that if we want to really safely reduce the number of kids in care, we have to improve the kind of family support services that are available to protect kids in their own home. And if you're doing this kind of, I'm not going to file because foster care is a bad thing, but we don't have extra services or help for people, it's really, a lot of times, I think really the lives of kids are being endangered here, when if we were going to do it the right way, we would think of the kind of supports that young mothers with substance abuse problems need. If babies are going to stay in those homes, what supports do those moms need? And there are all kinds of supports out there, some of which Washington State has some of them, but we have a PCAP program. We have pregnant and parenting women treatment programs. There is Child Haven in Seattle. There's a lot of programs that we could build on that would potentially make kids safe if they were to remain in family homes. But I don't see that that's really what's going on here. What I see is the influence of ideology. I see the influence of social values. I see the influence of people who have very strong commitments to racial justice and who feel that child welfare systems have become an instrument of social injustice. And so it'd be almost better if you just destroyed them or something, right? I see that kind of thinking. And now it's not just outside the agency, it's very much inside the agency. People inside child welfare are thinking have those kind of ideas as well. And of course, the managers have always thought for a long time that less kids in foster care is better than more kids because it costs less, you don't need as much money. We have foster care shortages to start off with. So there are all kind of rationales for why reducing the number of kids in care is a good thing. But there is going to be, and there already has been, a whole lot of really horrible cases around the country where kids now are going to be severely harmed or die because of this kind of crazy thinking. And to me, it is crazy. It's understandable based on what's happened in child welfare over a long period of time. It's also, to me, completely nuts because it's ideological. It's not based on a rational analysis of the kind of services and supports that families need. And I don't see the state actually using Family First to increase the number of those kind of supports. I mean, I hope I'm proven wrong. I hope the agency does the kind of things it needs to do, but I don't see it actually happen. And of course, in the meantime, we have these inadequate foster care system where we don't have therapeutic professional foster parents for the behaviorally troubled kids. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that child welfare in this country is in deep trouble. It's not just in Washington State. I mean, it's, you know, we're in many ways a completely average state in terms of the kind of influence, the kind of trends, kind of things that are happening, right? But the whole system is in deep, deep trouble. And a lot of that has to do with workforce kind of issues, the inability to retain people, to hire people when you have vacancies. I've sent out stuff in the last week or two about states in this country that have vacancy rates of 25 to 40%, 25 to 40% of all positions unfilled. And then, of course, the other caseworkers trying to pick up the slack there. And then, of course, after a while, they get fed up with that and they leave. So this is why these systems are in this unprecedented crisis here. And they've done it to themselves over a long period of time. They've created intolerable working environments for people. And so finally, a lot of young people just had it. Why should I go into child welfare? Why should I stay in child welfare when I can go work for a hospital and make $15,000 more a year and be treated decently? I mean, so anyway, yeah, it's a very dire kind of thing. So in the meantime, I do think that now there is a real question about the extent to which child welfare is even doing basic kind of child protection kind of things for very, very vulnerable kids. I think it really has become a question. And I am I've been concerned in past years, but I'm even more concerned at the current time. And not just here, but all over the country here. And it doesn't seem like whatever you say to people, it has that much of an effect. You know, I don't see child advocates in this state being outspoken about these matters much. I don't know what they're saying behind the scenes, but they're not saying it in public. So the way it looks to me now is they're just going to have to be some horrible things happen, and they are going to happen with kids. And they're going to have to be these horrible cases that make everyone completely angry before there's a change here. And it just doesn't have to be like that. So maybe that's all I need to say on that subject there. So let me stop. Let me see if anyone has a final comment or question here. So. Okay, well, if anyone has ideas for next time, you can either give them to Ryan or you could send them to me directly. Would be glad to, you know, talk about what everyone is interested in. I do want to say that I'm currently with the sounding board things I do every month. The last one I wrote on children's mental health issues, the children's mental health crisis in this country, which is it's bigger than child welfare by a lot. And so I'm going to write the next sounding board I do next week, end of next week, is going to be about a follow-up to that issue around what do we do about solutions, interventions to children's mental health issues, and not only in this state, but nationally. So thanks. Yeah. Ryan, maybe I'll just stop.
All right. Thanks, Dee. Have a great weekend.
Thank you
See you next month.
much.
Okay. Yeah. Bye-bye.
Bye.